It was supposed to be nothing. A short commercial. 30 seconds. Easy to ignore. The kind of thing that drops quietly, racks up a few views, and disappears into the background of a busy holiday morning. At first, that's exactly how it looked. People assumed it was just another athlete ad. Clean visuals, polished shots, the usual inspirational tone. No controversy. No message. Just branding doing what branding does. But behind the scenes, something about it immediately felt off. Not loud. Not messy. Just out of place in a way that made people uncomfortable without fully knowing why. Because this wasn't dropped on a random Tuesday. It landed on Christmas morning. That timing mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Christmas is supposed to be dead time. Offices quiet. Phones ignored. Executives convincing themselves that whatever chaos they survived all year could wait until January. No fires. No emergencies. No sudden decisions. And yet, within hours, quiet turned into tension. Calls started happening that weren't scheduled. Conversations got shorter. People stopped posting. What should have been a harmless ad suddenly became the only thing no one could stop talking about. Inside rooms the public never sees. What made it worse wasn't what the commercial showed. It was what it didn't ask permission to do. Because the moment people actually watched it closely, it became clear this wasn't designed to blend into a system. It didn't feel like part of a rollout. It didn't feel like a league moment. It felt standalone, confident, self-contained, like it didn't need approval from anyone else to exist. And that's when the mood changed. Because in certain spaces, independence isn't inspiring, it's threatening. Especially when it comes from someone who already commands attention without trying. If you're still here following this story, you're probably catching the same thing others did. And if breakdowns like this interest you, that's usually a sign you'll want to stick around. Stories like this don't stop at the surface. What started as a nothing commercial had quietly crossed an invisible line. And once that line was crossed, there was no uncrossing it. To really understand why that ad caused such unease, you have to understand how this league has always protected itself. Not publicly, not in press releases, but culturally. The WNBA was built on a simple belief. No individual should ever be bigger than the league itself. The shield comes first. The product comes first. Stars are important, but only as long as they don't tilt the balance too far in one direction. On paper, it sounds fair, even noble. Promote everyone. Spread opportunity. Keep the focus on the game instead of the personalities. It's a philosophy that helped the league survive years when attention was scarce and margins were thin. But that same philosophy starts to crack the moment a true outlier shows up. Because not every player moves the needle the same way. Some players are great. Some are dominant. And then there are players who pull attention toward them without asking for it. Players who don't need marketing to feel visible. Players who change ratings, ticket sales, and conversation just by existing. That's where Caitlin Clark enters the picture. From the start, she didn't fit neatly into the system. Not because she tried to stand out, but because everything around her reacted differently once she showed up. Cameras lingered longer. Crowds sounded louder. Games felt heavier, like they mattered a little more. The league tried to treat this moment carefully. Equal promotion. Shared spotlights. Controlled messaging. The idea was simple. Integrate the star without letting the structure bend. But here's the problem with that approach. You can manage messaging. You can't manage gravity. Attention doesn't distribute itself evenly just because an organization wants it to. It pools. It follows what people care about. And once that happens, pretending everyone occupies the same space starts to feel less like fairness and more like denial. That's why the ad felt different the moment people really processed it. It wasn't asking to be part of the system. It assumed it already stood outside of it. And once that realization set in, the question quietly shifted from, is this good marketing? To something far more uncomfortable. What happens when the league's biggest asset stops needing the league to be seen? What made this moment truly different wasn't the athlete. It was the company standing behind her. This wasn't a league announcement. It wasn't coordinated. It didn't come with a press conference or a carefully worded statement. The notification didn't come from a team account or a league office. It came straight from Nike. Clean, polished, confident. Nike didn't tease it. They didn't warm people up. They didn't wait for the right news cycle. They dropped it at exactly the moment no one was supposed to be paying attention, and trusted that attention would find it anyway. And it did. The commercial didn't feel like a sports ad. It felt like a declaration. High-budget visuals, cinematic pacing, cultural touchpoints that had nothing to do with league branding and everything to do with individual identity. This wasn't about uplifting a sport. It was about cementing a figure. What stood out most wasn't who appeared in the ad. It was who didn't. There was no sense of shared space. No reminder that this was part of something bigger. No nod to tradition or collective history. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This story didn't need a wider framework to make sense. That's a risky move in any league built on balance. But Nike doesn't move based on comfort. They move based on leverage. And leverage comes from knowing exactly where attention lives, and who controls it. In that moment, Nike wasn't selling shoes. They were signaling confidence. Not just in the athlete, but in the idea that this name alone could carry the weight of a massive campaign without help. If you've ever wondered how power actually shifts in sports, this is one of those moments worth paying attention to. And if you like breaking these moments down as they happen, that's usually a sign you'll want to keep following along. Because once Nike made that move, it stopped being about branding. It became about hierarchy. And the league felt it immediately. At first, reactions were emotional. Confusion. Frustration. A sense that something had slipped through the cracks. But emotions don't drive decisions for long in professional sports. Numbers do. And once the data started coming in, the conversation shifted fast. The ad didn't just perform well. It exploded. Views stacked up in hours, not days. Engagement climbed while most people were still opening gifts and watching football. By the end of the day, it was already being compared to campaigns that had taken weeks, sometimes months, to build momentum. That's when the quiet panic set in. Because this wasn't a case of marginal success. The gap was too wide. The contrast too obvious. In less than a full day, one athlete-centered commercial had generated more attention than entire league-wide promotional pushes. Not slightly more. Multiple times more. That kind of imbalance changes how people talk in meetings. Slides get skipped. Talking points get softened. Certain comparisons stop being made out loud because everyone already sees them. What the numbers revealed was uncomfortable but simple. The attention wasn't being distributed. It was being concentrated. And once that becomes visible, leverage shifts instantly. Not in public. Not in headlines. But in how seriously people take your position when negotiations start. In how much patience exists for long-term plans. In how willing partners are to wait their turn. The most unsettling part wasn't that the ad succeeded. It was that it succeeded without the league's infrastructure pushing it forward. No coordinated rollout. No official amplification. No institutional boost. Just one company, one athlete, and an audience that responded on instinct. In that moment, something became impossible to unsee. This wasn't a star being elevated by a system. It was a system struggling to keep up with a star. Once the numbers were undeniable, the discomfort spread beyond league offices. Owners noticed. Because owners don't just look at attention, they look at return. And what they saw raised questions no one wanted to answer too quickly. One of the league's most visible assets had just ignited a marketing firestorm, and none of that energy appeared to flow back through the usual channels. No shared revenue bump. No coordinated merchandise push. No obvious trickle-down. Just attention, landing elsewhere. That's when the quiet questions started circulating. Why wasn't this aligned? Why didn't the league benefit directly? How could something this big happen without a shared strategy? And maybe the most dangerous question of all, what does this say about who actually holds the leverage? Because in sports, perception often matters more than structure. It didn't matter whether the league had plans in place or long-term strategies unfolding behind the scenes. What mattered was how it looked. And what it looked like was one athlete receiving a level of treatment typically reserved for generational icons, while others, some with championships, awards, and years of service, continued to operate inside a far more controlled frame. Take Aya Wilson as an example. A champion, a multiple-time MVP, a face of reliability for the league and for Nike. Her campaigns felt purposeful, responsible, almost instructional. By comparison, this moment felt explosive. Whether that contrast was fair didn't really matter. In marketing, fairness is secondary to feeling. And the feeling spreading through the league was that the hierarchy had shifted, quietly, but unmistakably. Resentment doesn't need facts to grow. It only needs comparison. And once that comparison existed, it reframed everything. Hard fouls started being read differently. On-court intensity took on symbolic meaning. Every physical moment became evidence in a broader narrative about imbalance, favoritism, and control. The league wasn't just managing basketball anymore. It was managing symbolism. The timing couldn't have been worse. The league wasn't entering a calm period. It was already stretched thin. Ratings were up, but so were tensions. Visibility had exploded, but so had scrutiny. Every decision felt heavier because more eyes were watching, and more opinions were forming in real time. Negotiations loomed. Long-term planning mattered more than ever. The league needed unity, not fracture. Stability, not questions about who really held the cards. And then this landed. What made it so destabilizing wasn't just the success of the ad. It was how it reframed everything that came after. Suddenly, no moment existed in isolation. A hard foul wasn't just physical play. It was interpreted as resentment. A social media post wasn't just commentary. It was read as alignment or opposition. Basketball stopped being just basketball. It became symbolic. That's when product quality starts to suffer. Not because players stop caring, but because narratives begin to override nuance. Every clip feeds a storyline. Every interaction gets filtered through assumptions about favoritism, envy, or imbalance. The league had worked hard to keep the focus on collective growth. But this moment made that messaging harder to sustain. Because collective language rings hollow when one figure is clearly driving disproportionate attention. The irony is that none of this required intention. No one had to say anything out loud. No public statements were needed. The perception did all the work on its own. And once perception takes hold, correcting it becomes nearly impossible. This wasn't chaos yet. But it was pressure. And pressure has a way of exposing cracks that were already there. At some point, the conversation quietly crossed a line. Because once the dust settled, one truth became harder and harder to avoid. Caitlin Clark wasn't elevated by the system. The system was reacting to her. And that distinction changes everything. Leagues are comfortable when they believe they manufacture stars. When attention feels earned through structure, legacy, and process. What unsettles institutions is realizing that attention can exist independently. Strong enough to move markets, shape narratives, and attract capital without waiting for approval. That's the kind of power you can't regulate easily. This wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't even intentional. It was simply the byproduct of modern sports culture colliding with an organization built on balance. One side moves fast, follows attention, and rewards individuality. The other prioritizes control, equity, and long-term cohesion. Neither approach is wrong. But they don't coexist easily. The league could try to slow the moment down. Reframe it. Spread the spotlight wider. But gravity doesn't negotiate. Once fans decide who they care about, every attempt to dilute that focus feels artificial. And here's the part that made executives uneasy. This wasn't a peak. It was a preview. The commercial didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like a starting gun. A signal that the infrastructure around this athlete was just getting started. More visibility. Bigger campaigns. Louder moments that wouldn't always line up neatly with league priorities. That realization reframed the entire future. Because once a league understands that its biggest draw can thrive with or without institutional amplification, the leverage shifts permanently. You don't get it back by asking nicely. You don't fix it with messaging. You adapt, or you get dragged forward by it. And that's the tension still hanging in the air. Not drama, not controversy, but a question the sport hasn't fully answered yet. This wasn't about a commercial. It wasn't about shoes, branding, or even one athlete having a big moment. It was about exposure, the kind that reveals how value actually moves in modern sports. How attention doesn't wait for permission. How institutions built on balance struggle when individuality becomes unavoidable. And how uncomfortable it is to realize that growth doesn't always flow through the paths that were carefully designed for it. The league didn't lose control overnight, but it saw the edges of it. Because once fans decide who they're showing up for, everything else becomes secondary. Strategies adjust, power dynamics shift, and long-standing rules that once felt unbreakable suddenly look more like suggestions. This moment forced a reality check. Not just for executives or owners, but for the future of the sport itself. Can a league built on collective identity evolve fast enough to support a true superstar economy? Or will it keep trying to manage a force that no longer fits inside its original structure? That answer isn't coming from boardrooms. It's coming from attention. And attention has already made its choice. If you've been thinking about this story the same way I have, I want to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, whether you agree or see it differently. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what's really happening behind the scenes, hit like so more people find it. And if you want more deep dives like this, subscribe and stay here, because moments like this don't slow down. They multiply.